beyond. And that's why this topic, in terms of really demystifying the social license to operate. So what I'm hoping to cover today is a bit of a look back, so that we're all on the same page in terms of what is social license to operate. Why is it important? What are the key components that we see itself manifest as? Who are the main players, their mindsets? How do we move from most people thinking of it as just a communication to actually achieving social license to operate? And how do we actually see social license to operate evolving in the future? Then we'll look at some of the guidance that's actually available to help us and some of the key takeaways. Now, for those who've been on operational sites, the sign that's there in terms of permit to work must be obtained is something that we're all very used to seeing. And therefore, if at any point during this presentation, you feel like we're now out of our comfort zone, just come back to this sign, permit to work must be obtained. And that's the underlying principle to which we'll be applying across the presentation. So what is social license to operate? There is no universal definition in terms of what is social license to operate, but one that's commonly used is that outside of a government or legally granted right to operate a business, a company can only gain a social license to operate through broad acceptance of its activities by society or the local community. Without this approval, a business may not be able to carry on its activities without incurring serious delays and costs. Social license does not necessarily refer to a formal agreement or a document, but to actual real current credibility, reliability, and acceptance of organization and projects. It can be revoked at any time by the stakeholders. It is based on beliefs, perceptions, and opinions, and not necessarily facts held by the affected communities and other stakeholders. And this perception can vary between stakeholder groups and from time to time. And this are probably one of the main challenges that are faced by practitioners when they're looking at social license to operate. More than that, social license to operate does not mean that you need support from every stakeholder. It just means that you need a broad level of social acceptance. It's dynamic, it's non-permanent, it needs to be earned, strengthened, and maintained. And the more complex the environmental and social aspects, the more difficult it is to actually earn the social license to operate. So basically it's based on perceptions, but a big part of that is actually the external environment in which the stakeholders operate in, because they form a big part of actually forming those perceptions and beliefs. So the socioeconomic context, the socio-political context and governance, and the industry reputation play a key part in actually informing what those perceptions and beliefs are. But also in terms of how the company acts, in terms of respect, in terms of transactional legitimacy, in terms of compatibility of interest, play another key part in terms of really building trust, which is a core underlying aspect of what is social license to operate. There are different levels of social license to operate. At the very bottom of what's kind of like an iceberg is the rejection and withdrawal. This is where there is no social license to operate, and projects will face significant shutdowns, blockages, boycotts, violence, sabotage, and legal challenges as well. Moving one step up, you've got acceptance and tolerance. This is where there is a presence of perceived social legitimacy. There is some credibility. The project is there, the community tolerates it. There's still some lingering, recurring issues and threats. There's a watchful monitoring group. There's presence of outside NGOs. Moving one step further, you've got approvals and support. Here, companies are seen as good neighbors. They have actual pride in collaborative achievement with the community. And this is based on trust and a high level of credibility. Taking even one step further up, at the top of the iceberg, you've got co-ownership. And this is the kind of the highest level of social license that a project can have. You've got political support. The community is actually united with the project against critics. You've got advocacy. You've got core management of projects. And really here, the community and the other stakeholders are emotionally invested in the project side by side with the company. So really you can say the minimum level that you need to actually move forward is the acceptance stage, tolerance. This is the minimum that you need, but what companies should be aspiring for is actually the higher levels that lead to more sustainable relationships, that lead to maintenance of the social license. And as we look at why social license to operate is important, you will see why just remaining at that acceptance level might actually not achieve the project's deliverables. So what you've got in front of you is a poster by Oxfam. Home is where the bulldozers are. This photo was taken in Uganda, in an area where thousands of families used to call home. That's what the poster says. The poster is actually, what you see in front of you is a picture that was taken at Piccadilly Circus, a London Underground station. You'd ask yourself, well, why are Oxfam putting up a poster of a project that's happening in Uganda in an underground station in London? Who's going to look at this? Why is this important? And why is it placed there? These are probably some of the questions that are out there. What if I was then to tell you that this poster was strategically placed at Piccadilly because not far away, there were significant discussions ongoing around financing a refinery in Uganda that was going to be built on this land, which is home where the bulldozers are. That just goes to show the reach in terms of what people are going for in terms of addressing some of these issues. It's not as local as we might seem to think. It's not as contained as we might seem to think. So why is social license to operate important? In a study that was done by Ernst & Young on the top 10 business risks faced by mining and metals, and the same would apply for oil and gas as well, social license to operate moved from being the 7th top business risk in 2018 to being the #1 business risk in 2019-2020. In a space of just a year and a half to 2 years, this risk has moved from being #7 to #1. Question is, why is that? So there's growing pressure to look beyond profits, to really deliver genuine long-term value for all stakeholders being employees, being suppliers, being host governments, and communities in which they operate. And what companies are finding that those that integrate these elements into their business actually benefit from substantial benefits to their bottom line. Something that's nowadays being termed as the triple bottom line, meaning your profits, your people, and planet. And what are the substantial benefits? It's access to favorable financing. This could be debt financing or equity financing. Debt here being, if you're looking from a financial institution, they're going to be graded, all their assets and their investments, against basically factors such as social license. If you're looking at equity, a lot of shareholders nowadays actually care about where they're investing their money and not just looking at profits, and want to understand that what are the projects and what are their impacts. A lot of pension funds nowadays that actually do invest in a lot of private companies are being assessed on their performance based on their sustainability elements as well. Individuals that want to come and work on these projects nowadays actually have a belief that they also want to be seen to be people who are sustainable, who care about the environment, who care about people around them. They don't want to be associated with projects that had negative press or reputation, or that actually don't fit in with their own values. And therefore, it's quite key to top talent attraction and retention. Unlocking new market opportunities. More and more so nowadays, you're finding a drive in terms of it's not just the governments that have a key part in terms of saying this company will get a license or not, but a much wider group of stakeholders, including the community, in terms of an acceptance. And therefore, companies and projects that have a good reputation in terms of their focus for social license also are able to unlock new market opportunities that others might not be able to. And the other key driver for any optimization of value is cost. And we'll look at that in just a few minutes. So what we are seeing here in terms of social license is that ethical capitalization is therefore no longer seen as an additional, but an integral part of commercial value propositions. The social license to operate is therefore a critical part of value generation, risk management, and actual business delivery. So we talk about costs. This was a study that was done by the Centre for Social Responsibility for Mining at the University of Queensland in Australia. And it's very similar to what would apply across the whole extractive sector in terms of mining as well as oil and gas. And what they looked at is what is the cost to a project from the lack of social license to operate or having a minimal level of social license to operate, and therefore disruptions to the project. During the early initial kind of exploration phase, the cost would be up to like $10,000 per day. Kind of manageable maybe in terms of risk management and where you are in terms of the project. That actually increases fivefold as you move into more advanced exploration to about 50,000 a day. Numbers are beginning to pick up here. People are beginning now to start taking attention in terms of exactly what are the costs here, and therefore what is the opportunity cost in terms of social license. As you move more into development and operation, those costs move from about $50,000 a day to $20 million per week, a significant amount of cost that nobody can choose to ignore. And therefore, the investment that you actually put into social license earlier on in the process will actually pay dividends for you. And therefore, this is what we talk about: cost optimization, value, and risk in terms of why social license to operate. Extremely, extremely important. So how do people actually see whether they have social license to operate or not, especially if it's not an agreement? It's one of those where they say that you know you don't have it when you don't have it. You know, when the problems actually start is when you start seeing that you don't have the social license to operate. And how you see this is in what you're seeing in front of you, in areas such as land, especially on onshore projects where you need significant amount of land, and actually accessing that land leads to significant problems or delays. You need to start questioning yourself in terms of, one, what is your land access model, but also in terms of what is your social license to operate, and how are you managing the impacts of that land, especially when you look at the use of the land or the cultural or ancestral connection of that land to the communities around it. The grievance mechanism, is there one? Do people believe that it actually works? And therefore they don't have to resort to other mechanisms in terms of being heard or resolving matters, and therefore they work with the company in a sense of credibility and trust in terms of resolving any grievances. Water, whether it's the requirement for water, whether you're seeing sabotages happening to your own operational requirements for water constantly. Capacity building, you know, is there sufficient capacity building within the project that allows communities to be part of it in terms of local content and procurement, in terms of employment? Are there other players getting involved in capacity building, and therefore there's general acceptance and connection required with that project that many companies are willing, or institutions are willing, to be partnering with you? Communication and engagement, a big part of that is, one, understanding each other, understanding the project, and being able to work together to resolve you know, some of the issues. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail further down in the presentation. Managing social impacts, there will be significant in terms of influx, in terms of health, medical, in terms of environment, which we talked about in environmental impact. Governance, is there transparency? Do people understand the governance structure? Are the national and county governments also involved? Is there a mechanism where things can be resolved? Security and conflict, especially where this is already an ongoing issue. Any projects like this sometimes actually aggravate that, and you start seeing what potentially could be an underlying security and conflict issue manifesting itself as social license issues, or the other way around. And the acceptance of and the types of social investment projects that are actually being delivered. So who are the main players, and what are their key mindsets? And I've tried to summarize it to the top 5 here. You've got the companies, i.e. the project, you've got governments, you've got civil society, you've got the local businesses and people looking for employment, and you've got the communities as a whole. So from a company perspective, the key mindset is this is not about CSI. It's not about corporate social responsibility and social investment only. It's not just about having community liaison officers and therefore we've done everything that we need to do from a social license perspective. It's appreciating that in its role as the investor, in its role as the operator of the projects, it is actually the one leading to some of the impacts that need to be managed. And that acknowledgement is extremely important in terms of actually taking responsibility for their actions. A more holistic approach is required in terms of how it's being managed in terms of social license. It is an integral part of the business and an integral part of project delivery, risk management, and value generation. Not a sideshow, not something that happens as a byproduct by a team that sits on the side. And it requires the same time, the same focus and planning as any of the other disciplines. And that's the mindset that the company really needs to come with if it really wants to manage its social license to operate. Another big player is the government. In most jurisdictions, the company is actually a contractor to the government, where the resources belong to the people of that country. And therefore, the company is being brought on as a contractor to deliver those resources. These, if you're in like a PSC regime, clear roles and obligations will be provided for the company and the government within those agreements. And there needs to be an acknowledgement in terms of what are those roles and obligations, and more so that they actually seem to be delivering to those roles and obligations. And the government needs to also acknowledge the extent of that company's obligations and where it stops and where the government needs to step in. And that governance structure has to be transparent as well. So here, it's not that the government is just the assurer to make sure that the company does what it's supposed to do. It's also a partner, because it's the one that's brought the company in to manage the resources for the people. It needs to be an enabler as well. And there are many challenges that the company cannot resolve by itself, that it needs to look to the government for that. Then you've got civil society. And the role of civil society is to serve the purpose of securing the rights, the general welfare, and the development of all the people. And here it needs to balance out the positive effects that the project will bring to the community versus also managing the negative impacts of that project. And so provide a more balanced view in terms of supporting that project if it's going to bring positive impacts as a whole. And acknowledge its own role in terms of building capacity and understanding of the challenges and opportunities by the community, and not just leave this to the companies on their own to do. If they really want the communities to be fully aware and fully understand and take charge and in terms of how they manage this, then they do also have a role in terms of building that capacity. Then you look at the local content, the kind of local businesses and people looking for employment. And definitely here, whether it's provided within legislation or whether it's provided within the contracts that the companies has signed with the government, there is normally a very clear obligation towards local content. It is the right thing to do, and in many cases, it makes business sense as well to do that. But there has to be an acknowledgement here that this is not social investment. The companies are not going to provide employment and just give you contracts because they have to. It's your obligation to get that. there's a bit of, you also need to look at it as in terms of, I need to provide value. There has to be a business rationale here. I need to be competitive. I need to build my capacity and not just receive a salary at the end of the day. And when that happens, how can any company put a business rationale in front in terms of why local content should not happen? So when you combine all those four, you then come to the communities. And here it's more of a, I am not going to be a passive player here. I'm going to be an active player in terms of building my own capacity and understanding of the project and the issues and the impacts. Balance out the fact that I am going to get some value here from this project, but also there are going to be impacts that need to be managed. For example, if you look at Kenya, there is a share of the revenues that will go to the communities. And that is a positive impact, and you want to enable that project to get to that phase, otherwise you don't get those benefits. So there is a key driver here to enable the project, but there will be impacts as well. And the community therefore should be very active in terms of managing or working with the companies in terms of how do we actually manage those impacts. And really, you know, it's one of those where you can't do everything, and the company cannot do everything in terms of filling the gap between what the communities need, whether that is gap from a governance perspective or development of that area, etc. But there will be areas that have fall completely within an aligned interest, and focus should be on optimizing on those aligned interests, and appreciating that that company is a company that is there to make a profit, and hopefully it's a company that looks at value in terms of broader than just bottom line profits. But it's not a cash cow. It's not there just to hand out cash, nor is it there to replace the role of the government. So there has to be an understanding of what is the role and obligations of the company versus the roles and obligation of the company versus their own roles and obligations in terms of managing that. If that players and the mindsets are clear and people understand each other's roles and responsibilities, there's probably a better chance of them working together in terms of actually being able to deliver social license to operate. So, with a lot of people think that, well, what is, you know, social license to operate? I have a communication team, I have an external affairs team, and they will resolve all these problems for me. And I can just worry about what I need to deliver in terms of my technical aspects or my commercial aspects. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's not the case. And therefore, and when we talked about the mindset aspects of the company, that's a critical part of how we really need to run this. And therefore, the first thing we really need to be doing as projects is prepare and plan it. As any other aspect, we would not go out there and drill a well without doing significant studies in advance of that, actually doing a lot of planning in terms of the well design, going out there and understanding, having the right people in there and having the right teams in there. And therefore, there's no different here in terms of how the social license to operate should be managed. You need to start the process early. So your strategic stakeholder engagement process needs to start early. You cannot say we've done all our work, now we're ready, and therefore I'm going to give you 5 minutes in terms of when I'm going to come talk to you and we're going to make this happen. So you have to start early. You need to undertake a stage appropriate kind of social baseline service to really understand the key issues. What are the issues around land rights, land use? What are the formal and informal leadership structures that are out there? Who are the key interest groups? What are the local social and cultural norms that need to be taken into account when planning on if this work or actually delivery of the operational side of things as well? I need to really understand and manage your own impacts. That's not for the communities and other stakeholders to do. You need to understand what are the impacts of your project and how do you manage them. If it is land, if it is, for example, something that's sensitive to the community that matters a lot, can I actually, you know, rejigger a bit of my well pad so that I don't have to actually touch that part of the land? That could be a very easy fix that could actually resolve a lot of issues in terms of negative impacts and in terms of a lot of time and cost to the project, because they don't need to then do this at a later stage. They also need to understand their impacts not only from a today but from a future perspective as well. You might be looking in terms of exploration and saying, well, I'm actually exploring over here. So this is my community. And this is what I'm going to do in terms of benefits. As an example, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to have a borehole here so I can deliver water to you. And therefore I've managed some of the negative impacts of my exploration activities. Further down the line, I come into development and say, this is actually the area I want to develop. So although I've actually created, I've given you some water here, and therefore that was a positive impact, it's now created influx and actually a community around it. And now I'm coming years down the line and saying, actually, I need to move you all. So really understanding the impacts, not just today, but have a forward looking in terms of what are the overall total impacts and trying to manage those first yourself before trying to trace this into the communities. And then really work on that project mindset here. It has to be an integral part of the business, value generation and risk management. You need to understand that this is not just the responsibility of only one member of only one function. It needs to be owned at the very top of the organization, all the way in terms of leadership, in terms of agreeing strategies, in terms of agreeing the budget allocation, in terms of ensuring that it's bedded into all the operations in terms of activities, timescale, resources, etc. And that although there needs to be clear roles and responsibilities within the organization, it's that all the operational staff, the commercial staff, as well as the above ground risk staff understand that it is their joint responsibility in terms of enabling this to take place, although some people will take a lead over the others on some of these occasions. And that actually a systematic business approach can be applied. You can plan for these things, you can budget for these things, you can have a strategy around these things, you can plan an extensive engagement program around these things. And therefore, we shouldn't just walk away and say that there is no formula or there is no process. There's a lot of guidance in terms of how that can be done, and it's not needs to be looked at as any other business process that's here. And we really need to build our own team's capacity. Do they really understand the project? Are they integrated into the other areas? Do they understand the project as in today, intermediary and future? Do they understand the impacts? Have they had the right training in these areas? And actually equip them for success rather than just putting them out there and assuming that they'll just go talk to people and resolve the issues. It is really about planning and equipping your team for success here. So when you've done all of that, and as you're putting your strategic stakeholder engagement process together, it's really to understand who your stakeholders are. Who are they? Who are the influencers? Who are the decision makers? Who are the supporters? The figure that you see there around social ethnography tool is basically a kind of social science research method that's used in terms of a systematic way of documenting everyday lives, of behaviors and interactions of a community of people, so that you can actually understand who the main players are, the influence levels, the power levels, and also potentially the support that they have for the project. And being able to map this allows you to have a more, I'd say, deeper understanding of your stakeholders and have a more systematic way in terms of how you engage, who you engage with, because different players, depending on where they stand within that spectrum, will need a different set of information or a different set of time in terms of digesting that, or even in terms of what they can do to help you. Now that might seem very scientific, might seem that it takes a lot of time to do that. And even if companies are not willing to do that or can't do that for time reasons, you can still do that without having to go through an extensive study like that. It still requires to go out there and talk to people and understand your stakeholders, document them, and have a stakeholder register where you understand all of that. The stakeholder profile that you see in the figure below is all about that. It's kind of positioning them into bubble graphs in terms of the influence levels and the position levels, so you understand how to prioritize your stakeholders. Let me give you a very simple example here of a project that I worked on where they were trying to get land access. And part of the benefits that they were going to give was water and a borehole that was going to be delivered as part of that land access. And the team probably went quite a few times to actually talk to the men who were around that local community, around that building, that local having access, and the key part of that was delivery of the water borehole. And every time they would be sent back, and every time they would be sent back, and they couldn't understand what the underlying issues were. when they finally actually asked the question, but what is a real objection here? Because you don't seem to have an issue with us getting the land, and you don't seem to have an issue with us here in terms of actually coming and doing these operations because you'll get jobs, etc. The issue was water. The issue was having a borehole there, because at the moment the women were probably walking about 1 kilometer to collect water, and bringing the water close by would make the women lazy, was the comment that was being provided. So what do you do then? You switch your focus to the women. You go talk to the women and they're like, so we could save all that time and effort and walking there for a kilometer every day to collect water. Leave it to us. We'll convince the rest around this. And that's what unlocked it. Something very simple, by just not being able to understand the mindset and the concerns that those stakeholders had. Remember that your stakeholders are only human. They come with their emotional baggage, their concerns, their beliefs, their perceptions, and therefore they might not act in the way that you expect them to act. You might think that their behavior is irrational, but it is very rational if you actually think about where they're coming from and their concerns and their knowledge that they have. And by really working with them in that sense, you can actually communicate and engage to unlock some of these things. So don't think of it from a very procedural perspective. Actually try to understand what's behind all of that. Also need to understand your kind of capacity of the government here. As you go out to engage with these stakeholders, will the government be with you? Do they have the kind of people on the ground that can come with you? That includes national government and county government. Do they see that they want to be part of that process? And if that's the case, have you got the right people there? Have they got the right resources? Are you engaged enough that you all understand those issues? And that's very important that you kind of agree that from the onset, because otherwise what you're going to have is almost like multiple parties going out to talk to stakeholders on similar issues or issues that the parties are not as versed with. And an example of some of the things that we've seen maybe in a project I've worked on in Turkana is where initially it was very much the companies itself using its engagement team, but with the government bringing its own CLOs on board, it actually helped in terms of people seeing that this is not just a private company here that's talking, but they also have the backup of the government, and that the messages that they were getting were similar, and the teams actually worked together quite well in terms of managing those communications. So if you've planned it and you understand your stakeholders, there's generally like a 5-step process that you would follow in terms of from communication to actually getting to an agreement on social license. Inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. If we talk about inform, here it's really to provide a balanced and objective information to improve understanding of the issues, the alternatives, and the solution. It's not about convincing, it's provide the information, let them understand what is it that you're trying to do here, what is it you're trying to say, what are the impacts of the project more importantly. And it's important here to really understand how can you make it accessible and culturally appropriate in terms of communication. Who is it that you need to talk to? Do you need to talk to the chiefs first? Do you need to talk to the, the elders first? And who are the different groups? And then can you bring in the youth into that? Can you bring the women into that? And if you can't bring them into that group, then how do you manage it so that you still engage them in different groups? You need to bring in the communication to life in terms of visualization. Most of the people working on this project, probably this is not their first project, and they've started from seeing exploration where there was just seismic to the first well, to actually production where you've got a whole network of well pads and wells, and the whole logistics and ecosystem that go around it. But sometimes for those communities, this is the first time that they're seeing that. Their reality has been the same for years and years and years, and you're coming and changing their reality, and yet you're expecting them to see into what the future is going to look like, yet they can't visualize that. And what we have seen in the past is where people do kind of animated videos so people can understand. So there's a picture there in the corner in terms of onshore oil and gas pipeline construction sequence. And this is something that a number of companies have used for quite a long time now. Where, for example, someone is saying, I'm building a pipeline from A to B and it's going to be buried and therefore it will not impact you. The person is sitting there going, so you need the land. Okay, there's going to be disruption. You're going to build all these trenches, bulldozers, etc. But you're telling me that it's not going to disrupt me and my activities. What the video will do is show them over the different phases. There will be an impact in the first few years, but once the pipeline has been buried, once the land has been leveled, the landscape restored, what it would look like and how similar it actually is to what it is today. And usually with all of these videos, what we try and do is customize it to the sense that the landscape looks like the landscape of where you're operating. The people look the same kind of issues, so that people can actually start visualizing and seeing that. You also have tools nowadays around kind of gamification and virtual reality, where you can see a picture there with the virtual reality goggles, where you can actually, what you can do is stimulate an experience by generating kind of realistic images. And at the same time, the sounds and other sensations, that people can actually feel like they're there. They can actually feel themselves standing there on the ground and seeing what's in front of them. And with people, they process visuals probably about 60,000 times faster than text. And then what you'll find is once people can visualize it, they understand it better. And the memory is also significantly more. They'll remember a visual picture more than they'll remember text. So when you come back later to have those discussions, that visual picture is still there. And really, it's about providing reliable and accurate information, not once, not a one-off, but on an ongoing basis. And remember that this is something that companies might have thought about for a long time. Communities are seeing it for the first time. Different people need to be involved. Different people are seeing it at different phases. And therefore, it's about constant communication. That's key. Consultation is all about obtaining feedback from your stakeholders. Do you understand their issues, their alternatives, and the decisions? Do they understand those as well? It's not just about presenting the facts and one option. It's about demonstrating that you are listening. It's about demonstrating that you understand. And the key thing here is that you have your own company time perspective. But you might have been thinking about this for a while. You've been planning this for a while. You've had to think about all the kind of technical aspects, cost aspects, commercial things there, above ground, what your environmental social impacts are going to be, etc. The company need time as well to do exactly what you've done. They need time to reach out and actually consult amongst themselves. They need time to absorb this because this is probably something that they're not used to doing. They need to involve all the right people. The picture that you're seeing down there is a land consultation meeting where a number of meetings like these need to be held so that all the various stakeholders are actually engaged and then come back to it again after a while to actually understand those impacts. So you really need to be careful around, it's not just the company's time perspective that needs to be taken into account, but also the community's time perspective. When you talk about benefits to the company might be in production in 3-4 years time. From a community perspective is probably, but we need that development today. I need that employment today if I'm supposed to feed my family. Don't promise me something in 4 or 5 years time if I don't have anything today. So those kind of matching of time perspectives is extremely important in all messaging and all consultation. And relationship is key here. This is not a commercial deal. Well, it's all about getting the best out of it. Just it doesn't matter about whether you're going to see those people again or not. Just basically get the deal, get it signed in, get your best deal in, and walk out of that room. This is not that. You want to be a neighbor for a very, very long time. This isn't a transaction. This is relationship building, and that consultation is a key part of that relationship. When we looked earlier at the different social license levels and moving from that kind of acceptance tolerance to kind of co-ownership, the key driver there in terms of building credibility and building trust is actually relationships. Do we want to work together? Do we trust each other? Do we actually believe in the capabilities of each other as well? Not different from any other aspect of life. And the same thing applies here as well. So gone through the informed process, the consultation process. This is not as linear as it might look on a presentation. Number of iterations might be required. Some of these phases will kind of blend into one. So when you talk about involve, you talk about working directly with the stakeholders through a process to ensure that issues and concerns are consistently understood and considered. So again, the inform, consult, involve kind of becomes one process. Collaborate, partner with stakeholders in each aspect of the decision-making process, and empower, actually final decision-making to be placed in the hands of the stakeholders. So another example here around land access is where a project, you should always say, come in, actually negotiate with the community and say, okay, so this is how much we're willing to put in terms of money to it, and we will build you a school here, or a hospital here, or we'll give you water here. And then they go ahead and they deliver that and walk away. What happens there is there's no ownership from that community's perspective. And that benefit has been given once. And then it's like, so now what else are you going to give me? That same model was basically turned on its head to say, okay, we still need to negotiate for land, and we will compensate for that land. But instead of us saying we're going to do A, B, or C, we're going to basically say we're going to give you like a trust, like a fund. And as the community, you will have to go through a process, a capacity building process for 3 to 6 months in terms of managing these funds. And then together we will look at what do you need, and you will actually manage that process of delivery, whereas we will provide technical support along the way. Completely change the perspective there in terms of ownership of that community, and them starting to think around, longer term development rather than what the company can give me versus what can I do for myself. One of those projects was a secondary school that was built by the community, and every time you talk to them, there's so much pride there because we did that. It was the first secondary school within a 50-kilometer radius. So again, a key enabler for that community. And they managed to get year one, the classroom for year one, and they brought their first intake. In the following years, as year one moved to year two, the community then started putting their funds together in terms of building the classrooms for the second year. So that ownership and them taking actual control of that was through a kind of collaborative and an empowerment process that the company went through. So here, when working together, it's very important to understand that the process is about managing risks and managing opportunities. Yeah, so this is not about a win-win situation, but it's about managing risks and opportunities. And as part of that, the first thing that the company needs to be thinking about is, well, how do I actually maximize my local employment and the other opportunities to ensure equitable distribution of benefits and opportunities? This isn't a kind of must-have or an extra. What I meant to say is this is not an extra, but this is almost like the baseline. How can I actually maximize my local employment and other opportunities, and everything else then comes on top of that. And as part of that is the whole capacity building elements that are there. Need to look for solutions that are as part of the business, so not a separate element such as social investment. If I use an example of water here, you can run your own kind of boreholes and everything else, but you need water for the operations as well. So why not actually look for solutions that actually meet the operating requirements as well as the community requirements? Or if you're looking for certain skills that are there that you need for the business, then why not actually focus on capacity building around those skills, because they benefit you from a company perspective, they benefit the community because they're getting skills, but more important than that, they're getting skills they can apply in employment and get paid. Rather than them just being given skills on the side that they can't get employed from. So really look within the business in terms of what is it that we need as a business, but at the same time can provide significant benefits to that community, rather than just building structures out there that don't actually provide any kind of mutual benefit. Key part of that is actually sustainability, because if there's a mutual benefit that's there, it will be sustainable. The other aspect of that is like multi-stakeholder firms. So here it's about, if it is really about collaboration, and if it is really about the fact that the companies are there if it's oil and gas, they're there to find the oil and produce the oil. They're not there in terms of running institutions and capacity building and running water network systems, etc. So they're now being taken out of their comfort zone or out of their area of expertise. By bringing in multi-stakeholder forum, you're actually bringing a multitude of stakeholders from the government, from the county government, from the community, from civil society, from other interested parties, where they can actually say, well, how can we collaborate together to move this forward? And that shared responsibility, and especially around strategic partnerships, actually make these projects successful, because you get different perspectives. And even in your interest groups, even within the community, there's going to be different interests. You'll have the business elite, which will have their own interest. You will have the elders that will have their own interest. You will have the women who will have their own interest. You'll have the youth that will have their own interest. And by actually bringing these multi-stakeholder forums together, you are ensuring that you have a common interest, or you understand each other's perspective, and you're not only just building and developing or helping empower one group over the other. And bringing in strategic partnerships mean, if there, for example, are some elements around capacity building, there are a lot of international organizations and institutions that are far better equipped in doing that. And the company can play a role in that as a strategic partner, but the lead might be somebody else completely, because it's part of their program and agenda as well. Actually extending that reach means that you get more in, rather than trying to hold control within one project. Key thing here is that we talked about the fact that social license to operate is not about a written legal agreement. It is about getting that consent. It is about give and take. So really understand what is your acceptable baseline and be open to compromise. And this means both parties, or all parties if you're looking at it from a stakeholder, multi-stakeholder, and understand what success actually is here. And if we go back to what is social license to operate, it is about value generation. It is about risk management, and it is about business delivery. And it's finding that balance between those items that is actually success here. And that value definition here is a mutual shared prosperity as well. So what is it, once we talk about what is that communication to a social license to operate, what are the areas that most projects actually trip? You'll see two pictures in front of you. The first picture is a roadblock in Turkana. These are there'll be twigs and branches on the road that basically block vehicles and people from passing. And you'll probably find it's either unmanned, or you'll have a couple of people sitting on the side. And this is very much almost like an invitation to, I need to talk to you. And there are issues that we need to resolve either with you, or that we need to attract attention so that the government can resolve them, etc. It could easily move to the picture below. And the picture below is not in Kenya. The picture below is an incident with respect to mining in South Africa, and where you can see there that what started probably as a roadblock similar to the picture above in terms of twigs and branches across the road actually turned into potentially something with a lot of injuries and fatality there, because the issues could not be resolved as they were, or there was not a mechanism in which the communication could take place. And this is the key thing here, is you don't want it to actually get to that bottom picture. And what are the areas that most people, why these projects actually start having risks around this social license to operate and rejection of the projects? There's a lack of sufficient leadership support at the very top. So the strategies are not clear, the resources are not being allocated clearly in terms of people, money, etc. And what you're seeing as might be strategy is not what's being implemented on the ground. And every struggle is there in terms of, this teamwork and different things, and that you just don't have that alignment. And the clear strategy of dealing with SLO has not been actually embedded within the business, and therefore it doesn't actually provide that value. It's seen as transactional. It's not establishing lasting relationships based on trust. It's incident by incident, activity by activity. It's not honoring commitments. So actually don't deliver what you say you will. And this might not be because the company wants to walk out of their commitments. It could be some of the earlier issues, some of what we talked about. The lack of leadership support means that somebody has committed to something and then finds that when they go back, they don't have the budget for that. It could be elements like that. It doesn't mean that the company is necessarily trying to cheat anybody here, but it's all the other manifestations that are leading to this. It's not managing the key issues in terms of risks, drivers of change and opportunities proactively and strategically, waiting till an issue has happened, which therefore means that you don't have time to resolve them. And confusing technical credibility of the project with social credibility, acceptance with actually approval, and cooperation with actual trust. So those are the kind of main areas that you find that if companies can work on those areas, they can actually improve their chances of actually getting social license to operate. So how do we see social license to operate evolving in the near future? There's quite an increase in societal participation beyond local communities. With social media nowadays, nothing is retained within that one area. Everything is put out there, especially now post-COVID. I think we've all become social media experts out there. And these kind of things will transfer, and there's a lot of pressure from different groups in terms of participation. There's a rise of minority voices. This could be in terms of indigenous people, it could be in terms of women, in terms of youths, etc. And therefore, you're getting more people coming up and talking about their aspects, their perceptions, their beliefs, and also what is shared prosperity for them. There's an advancement in technology. Now, this is twofold. One way is basically automation and therefore reduction in the types of roles and requirements, especially around casual labor, etc., which most people see tend to be the area where local content can be increased in the initial phases before capacity building. And there's also the other aspect of technology where it means that nothing is left local and everything is shared out there. But it also means that you can use technology at the same time, like in communication, like we saw the virtual reality goggles. There's an increased expectation of shared value outcomes, and this is not just from the local communities, but I would say globally. People have stopped using the term bottom line to triple bottom line. It is about profits, it is about people, it is about planet. And therefore, there's an expectation across the board in terms of shared value outcomes. There's increasing disclosure pressures. Most big companies nowadays will have a sustainability report where they need to talk about their social and environmental impacts. And there's guidance like the GRI who provide on terms of all these frameworks that are being put in place in terms of governance, where you don't just report on your financial data, but you also need to start reporting on social and environmental as well. And there's a significant rise in litigation. In terms of interested parties that are there, in terms of not just the litigations being more local, but more global litigations as well. But those are probably impacts that we're seeing in terms of that increasing pressure on social license and sustainability. But a recent study that was done on the kind of UN sustainable goals, 92% of the CEOs that were interviewed believe that integration of sustainability is critical to business success. 48% of the companies that were interviewed actually said that they were implementing sustainability in their operations. So 92% believe that it's critical, but only 48% are actually implementing those sustainability initiatives in their operations. 21% of those CLOs believe that business is currently playing a critical role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But only 4% of the roles and specifications demand sustainability experience or mindset. What you're seeing there is that there is an increasing understanding and importance within the organization. You know, we've got 92% of those interviewed saying that integration is critical. But then there's still quite a bit of work in terms of driving this towards a value shift, but it is happening. With 92% believing it's important, you'll start seeing those numbers of 4, 21, and 48 rising towards the 92%. So there is a general shift here in terms of a pull and push pressure happening. So with all of that, people would be saying, so where do I go for help if I need to understand how do I need to do this? What are the procedures, the policies, etc. And there is actually quite a lot out there. You've got the IFC performance guidelines, standards that are there around how companies should be managing their environmental and social impacts. You've got the Global Reporting Initiative that is there in terms of what it does provide is independent standards to help organization understand, communicate their impacts. You've got the Equator Principles, which is a risk management framework for determining and assessing and managing environmental and social impacts in project financing. You've got national legislation, local legislation. If I take Kenya's example, you've got the Community Land Act, you've got all the environmental acts, you've got the constitution itself that provides for public participation. You've got the International Standardization Organization that has standards around things like social responsibility, risk management, development. You've got the Sustainable Development Goals. You've got companies' own policies and procedures that are being based on a lot of these other guidelines. And you've got significant case studies that are out there in terms of where companies have done things right or projects right and when things have not gone wrong and what the key lessons learned are. And you've also got a number of institutions around the world like IPCA, like International Council on Mining and Metals, Institute of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, that provide significant publications as well as guidance that people can use. And what I always say to people is when you looked at all of this and there still isn't something that you need to help you, is look at your internal radar. Because if you understand social license to operate and its importance from a value perspective, from a risk management perspective, from a business delivery perspective, then your internal radar will actually guide you towards doing the right thing here. But there is a lot of guidance that's actually available out there nowadays. So with that, I would like to get to some of the key takeaways from today's presentation. And I'm hoping after that presentation, most people will appreciate that social license to operate is actually dynamic and non-permanent. It needs to be earned, strengthened, and maintained. And the more complex your environmental and social aspects are, the more difficult it is to earn your social license to operate. That social license to operate should be an integral and key part of value generation, risk management, and business delivery. Not something that sits on the side, but an integral part of how you run your business. You need to have a more longer term perspective. So start building relationships. It's not about transactions, it's about relationships. And actually look for initiatives that are sustainable, that you can start them off maybe as the project, but then in time actually hand them over to the communities and let them take ownership and responsibility, and that they are sustainable without the project or the company itself. You really need to know who your stakeholders are. And even within that broader stakeholder group, understand, refine, and recognize the roles, responsibilities, rights, and obligations of the different parties involved, not just within the communities, but including governments, including civil society as well. And really look for solutions as part of the business across the functions to reduce impacts instead of compensating or looking for solutions in isolation. One, they won't provide that value generation and risk management or business delivery. And two, they're probably not going to be sustainable going forward. And really, we all need to understand here that as much as all the things that we want to do and achieve in life, we have limited time, we have limited resources, etc. But there will be key areas where there's aligned interests and synergies. And actually, if we capitalize on those, we can probably get more mileage in terms of value, in terms of shared prosperity, in terms of risk management. And by bringing in other players, multi-stakeholder